He thought money could buy anything, including a man's dignity. When a stressed hedge fund manager tries to bully a quiet passenger out of seat 1A, he assumes he's just dealing with an upgrade mistake. He insults him, bribes him, and calls security on him. But he forgot one rule. True power doesn't need to shout. Watch the satisfying moment the cockpit door opens and the arrogant passenger in the hoodie is revealed to be the only person on the plane who can fire the captain. The rain at JFK International Airport was not the romantic kind. It was a gray industrial sheet of water that hammered against the reinforced glass of the Sterling Airlines flagship lounge, distorting the view of the Boeing 777 parked at Gate 42. David pulled his gaze away from the window. At 55, he had learned that patience was not just a virtue but a weapon. He adjusted the cuff of his gray hoodie. It was cashmere, soft and incredibly warm, but to the untrained eye, it looked like something bought from a discount rack at a department store. That was the point. Today, David was not David Sterling, the man who had just finalized a hostile takeover of the failing airline in a boardroom in Chicago 48 hours ago. Today, he was just a passenger in seat 1A. He took a sip of his black coffee. It was lukewarm. He made a mental note. Coffee station temperature monitors need calibration. Details matter. He opened the leather-bound journal on his lap. It was old, the spine cracked, filled with the handwriting of his late wife, Elena. She had been a flight attendant for 30 years, back when the job was about service and grace, not crowd control and de-escalation. She had died 6 months ago, leaving him with a fortune he didn't need and a company he hadn't wanted until he read her journals. They treat us like inventory, David, she had written on page 42. The passengers are wallets, and we are just the hands that open them. Excuse me. A voice cut through his thoughts. David looked up. A young cleaner, maybe 20 years old, was struggling with a heavy cart of dirty dishes near the entrance. A wheel had caught on the edge of a rug. David didn't summon help. He stood up, walked over, and gently lifted the front of the cart. The carpet edge is loose, David said softly. Try pulling from the side. The boy looked terrified, as if he expected a reprimand. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry to disturb you. You didn't disturb me. Work is work, David said, offering a small, genuine smile. The door to the lounge flew open. The quiet hum of the room, the clinking of silverware, the soft jazz, the murmurs of business deals, was instantly shattered. Brad marched in. He was a man who moved as if the air around him was too thick, and he had to physically shove it aside. He was wearing a navy bespoke suit that cost more than the cleaner's annual salary. A gold watch, heavy and ostentatious, flashed on his wrist as he held a phone to his ear. I don't care about the regulatory hurdles, Mike, Brad shouted, oblivious to the heads turning in his direction. If that merger doesn't close by 4 o'clock, we are exposed. I am exposed. Fix it, or don't bother coming in on Monday. Brad ended the call and shoved the phone into his pocket. He looked around the lounge with a sneer of dissatisfaction, scanning the room not for a place to sit, but for a place that signaled dominance. David watched him. He knew the type. He had fired dozens of men like Brad. Men who mistook volume for authority and anxiety for ambition. Brad headed for the coffee station. He was moving too fast, his movements jerky with adrenaline and caffeine. As he reached for a sugar packet, his elbow clipped a ceramic pitcher of milk. It didn't shatter, but it wobbled dangerously, splashing a significant amount of milk onto the granite counter and dripping onto the floor, inches from David's sneakers. Brad didn't stop. He didn't check. He ripped the sugar packet open, dumped it into his cup and turned to leave. You dropped something, David said. His voice was calm, carrying easily across the short distance. Brad stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on David. He took in the hoodie, the faded jeans, the scuffed sneakers. He blinked as if processing an error in his visual field. Excuse me, Brad asked. The milk, David pointed. You spilled it. Someone might slip. Brad let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked at the cleaner, then back at David. That's what they're paid for, buddy. And hey, while you're standing there, grab me a napkin. I got a spot on my cuff. The silence that followed was heavy. The cleaner froze. David didn't move. He simply held Brad's gaze. It wasn't a glare. It was an assessment. Calculation. I am not staff, David said. Brad rolled his eyes, turning away. Could have fooled me. Dress the part if you don't want the job. He walked away, taking the prime seat by the window, immediately pulling out his laptop and typing furiously. David watched him go. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound sense of disappointment. So this is the clientele we prioritize, he thought. The platinum elites. He took his pen and wrote in his journal. 8:15 a.m. JFK Lounge. Incident 1. Lack of accountability is contagious. If the customer doesn't care, why should the staff? Sarah stood at the entrance of the aircraft, forcing the corners of her mouth upward. Her cheeks ached. She had been awake since 4 a.m. Her student loan payment was overdue, and her mother's medical bills were sitting in a stack on her kitchen table in Queens. She needed this shift. More importantly, she needed this shift to be boring. Welcome aboard, she said to a sweet elderly couple. Seats 3A and 3B, right down the left aisle. She checked her tablet. The manifest for first class was full. Seat 1A was listed as D. Sterling. No status listed. No frequent flyer number. Just a name. Seat 1B was Bradford C. Halloway. Status: Diamond Platinum. The little icon next to his name was a red star, which in the airline's internal coding system meant high value, high maintenance. Do not say no. Sarah tightened her grip on the tablet. She hated the red stars. David was the first to board the premium cabin. He walked in with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He paused at the door, nodding to Sarah. Good morning, he said. He looked her in the eye. Not at her uniform, not at her name tag, but at her eyes. Rough weather for flying. Good morning, sir. Sarah recited the script. Let me check your boarding pass. He showed it to her. Seat 1A. Right this way, Mr. Sterling. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage? Water, champagne. Water would be fine, thank you, David said. He moved to seat 1A, placing his bag in the overhead bin with an easy, fluid strength. He sat down, buckled his seatbelt immediately, and opened his journal again. He looked like a man who was perfectly content to be invisible. Then Brad boarded. He brought a gust of chaotic energy with him. He was still on the phone, or perhaps on the phone again. No, I don't care what the legal team says. Pushing the boundaries is how we make money. Just get the contract ready. He stopped at the entrance, holding up his phone to Sarah without breaking his conversation, showing his digital boarding pass. He didn't look at her. He treated her like a QR code scanner. Sarah scanned it. Welcome back, Mr. Halloway. Seat 1B. Brad lowered the phone, finally looking into the cabin. He froze. He saw David in seat 1A. David was settled, reading, occupying the window seat that Brad clearly coveted. The two seats in row 1 were adjacent, separated by a console, but in this configuration, 1A had the slightly better privacy partition. Brad frowned. He looked at his boarding pass, then at David, then back at Sarah. Miss. Brad beckoned Sarah over with a sharp snap of his fingers. Sarah felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Yes, Mr. Halloway? How can I help you? Brad lowered his voice, leaning in close, smelling of expensive cologne and stale coffee. There's been a mistake. I think you let a standby passenger or a mechanic sit in the first-class cabin. Sarah looked at David. He was writing in his journal, seemingly oblivious. I'm sorry, sir. That is Mr. Sterling. He is a ticketed passenger. Brad let out a scoff, shaking his head as if Sarah was a child who couldn't understand simple math. Look at him, Brad whispered, gesturing vaguely at David's hoodie. He's wearing a gym outfit. He's probably an employee deadheading to another city, right? Or maybe a lottery winner. Mr. Sterling paid for his ticket, sir, Sarah said, her voice firm but polite. Please take your seat so we can continue boarding. Brad didn't move. He stared at David. The logic in his head was breaking down. In Brad's world, first class was a country club. It had a dress code. It had unwritten rules. You wore a suit. You had a laptop. You looked stressed. You didn't wear a hoodie and look peaceful. Brad finally stepped into the aisle and approached row 1. He didn't sit. He stood over David, casting a shadow over the open journal. David finished the sentence he was writing. He didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch for 3 seconds, a power move that Brad didn't even recognize. Then David slowly raised his head. "Can I help you?" David asked. "You're in my row," Brad said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. "I am in seat 1A, David corrected gently. "I believe you are in 1B. Brad huffed, finally sitting down in 1B. He slammed his leather briefcase onto the floor. He began to spread out immediately. He placed his phone on the center console, then his tablet, then a stack of files. He encroached on David's side of the armrest, his elbow jutting out aggressively. David watched the invasion of space. He calmly picked up his water glass, which Brad's elbow was dangerously close to knocking over, and moved it to his other side. "You mind?" Brad snapped, noticing the movement. "I have work to do. Mergers and acquisitions. Big league stuff. I need space." "I mind," David said, his voice even. "And I believe the big league usually involves respecting property boundaries." Across the aisle in seat 1C, an older man named Elias lowered his newspaper. Elias was 65, a retired logistics manager for a shipping fleet. He had spent 40 years dealing with union disputes and dockyard brawls. He knew trouble when he saw it. He watched Brad over the rim of his reading glasses, his face unreadable. "Excuse me." Brad turned fully to David now. The plane was still boarding, people shuffling past them to get to economy. Brad seemed to realize he had an audience, and his ego demanded he win this interaction. "I'm trying to work here. I generate millions of dollars for the economy. What do you do? Write poetry in your little diary." David closed the journal. He placed both hands on the cover. "I observe." "You observe," Brad mocked. "Great. Well, observe this. I need this row to be a professional environment. You're killing the vibe. Seriously, how did you get this seat? Miles? Employee comp." David turned his body slightly towards the window, dismissing Brad effectively. "I bought the ticket. Just like you." Brad's face reddened. Being ignored was worse than being yelled at. He pressed the call button. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Sarah hurried over from the galley, dodging a passenger trying to shove an oversized guitar case into a bin. "Yes, Mr. Holloway? This isn't working," Brad said loudly. "I can't work next to this." "Sir, is there a problem with the seat?" Sarah asked, checking the recline button. "The seat is fine. The neighbor is the problem," Brad said, gesturing at David as if he were a piece of luggage. "He's hovering. He's distracting. I have sensitive documents here. Client confidentiality. I can't have some random guy reading over my shoulder." David spoke without looking away from the window. "I have no interest in your documents, Mr. Holloway, though I would suggest you not leave the cover sheet of the Triton merger visible to the aisle if confidentiality is truly your concern." Brad slammed his hand down on the papers to cover them. He looked at Sarah, his eyes wide with manufactured outrage. "See, he's looking. He's spying. This is a security risk." Sarah looked helpless. "Sir, he's just sitting there." "I want him moved," Brad demanded. "Move him to row 5. Or economy plus. I'll pay for the difference. Hell, give him a voucher. Just get him out of my sight so I can focus." "I cannot move a passenger who doesn't want to move, sir," Sarah said. Her voice was trembling slightly. She knew the platinum policy. She knew she was supposed to find a solution. But there was no solution here that was fair. Brad pulled out his phone again. He opened the airline app and shoved the screen toward Sarah's face. "Read this, Sarah," Brad hissed. "Platinum member guarantee. A conducive environment for productivity and rest. Are you refusing to honor the guarantee? Because I can email the VP of Customer Experience right now. I have his email saved. Do you want me to hit send? Do you want to explain to your supervisor why a Diamond member was forced to sit in a hostile environment? It was a trap. A cruel corporate trap. If Sarah said no, he would report her for insubordination and poor service. If she said yes, she would have to humiliate David. The cabin had gone quiet. Even the economy passengers shuffling past had slowed down to watch. In seat 2A, a teenager with bleached hair pulled out his phone. He didn't lift it high. He held it against his chest, camera lens poking out recording the scene. David sighed. It was a sound of deep, weary exhaustion. He turned back to face Brad and Sarah. "Sarah," David said gently. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of frustration. "Yes, sir." "Do not worry about the email," David said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses. He put them on, transforming his face from casual to scholarly in an instant. "Go ahead and email the VP," David said to Brad. "In fact, copy the board of directors if you like. But you should probably spell the name correctly in your complaint." Brad blinked, confused by the sudden shift in David's demeanor. "What?" "The name," David said, leaning forward slightly. "For your complaint. It's Sterling. Sterling. Make sure you get it right. Details matter." Brad stared at him. For a second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But his arrogance was a heavy blanket, smothering his survival instincts. He laughed. A cruel, dismissive bark of a laugh. "Sterling," Brad repeated. "Right. Like the silver. Cute. Look, buddy, I don't care what your name is. I care that you're in my space. So are we doing this the easy way? Or the hard way?" David didn't answer. He just picked up his pen and opened his journal again. 8:45 a.m. Incident 2. The weaponization of policy. The staff is paralyzed by fear of the customer. This is not a service culture. It is a hostage situation. "I'm waiting," Brad said, tapping his foot impatiently. "Sarah, find a solution. Now." Sarah looked at David, pleading silently with her eyes. "Please just move. For your own sake. For mine." David looked at her. He understood her fear. He knew exactly how much she made per hour. He knew the turnover rate for her position. He knew that she was one complaint away from a performance review that could freeze her pay. "I am comfortable here," David said to Sarah, his voice soft but immovable as a mountain. "I will not be moving." Brad's face turned a shade of crimson that clashed with his tie. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, looming over David. "Okay," Brad said, reaching for his wallet. "Okay. You want to play hardball? Let's speak a language you understand." The plane gave a sudden lurch as the tug disconnected, but nobody moved to sit down. The air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just a seating dispute. It was a collision of two worlds. And only one man knew that the collision had already happened, and the wreckage was inevitable. David looked at the wallet in Brad's hand. He saw the thick wad of cash. "I strongly advise against doing what you are about to do," David said. "Watch me," Brad sneered. And that was when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Miller from the flight deck. We have a bit of a situation with the weather radar. Looks like a 30-minute hold here at the gate. We apologize for the delay. We'll turn the AC up shortly." The delay. The heat. The confined space. It was the spark that Brad's temper had been waiting for. 30 minutes? Brad yelled at the ceiling. "I don't have 30 minutes. He looked down at David, his eyes wild. "This is your fault. Your bad luck. Your bad energy." He pulled a $500 bill from his wallet, a crisp, rare bill he kept for showing off. He slapped it onto David's journal. "There," Brad said. $500. Tax-free. Probably more than you make in a week. Take it, grab your bag and get back to row 30. I need to make some calls and I can't do it with you listening." The cabin went deadly silent. Even the baby in row 4 seemed to stop crying. David looked at the money. The bill sat on top of his wife's handwriting. It covered the words dignity and grace. Slowly, very slowly, David closed the journal, trapping the bill inside. He stood up. David was not a tall man, but he had the posture of someone who had carried heavy things his entire life without breaking. He stood eye to eye with Brad. "You assume," David said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a controlled intensity that made the hair on Elias's arm stand up, "that my time is worth less than yours because of how I dress. You assume that my silence is submission. And you assume that this seat," he tapped the headrest of one, "is a commodity you can purchase like a stock option. Everything is for sale," Brad smirked, though he took half a step back. "That's how the world works. That is a dangerous assumption in risk management," David said. And you are currently over-leveraged. Stop using big words you heard on TV to sound smart, Brad snapped, his insecurity flaring. Just take the money and go. Don't be an idiot. Brad reached out, trying to shove the journal, and the money, into David's chest, trying to physically push him toward the aisle. It was a mistake. David's hand moved. It was a blur. He didn't strike. He simply intercepted. He caught Brad's wrist in midair, inches from his chest. The grip was iron. Brad gasped, his eyes widening. He tried to pull back, but David held him fast. Do not, David whispered, and the sound was more terrifying than a shout. Touch me. For a moment they were frozen. The wealthy banker in the bespoke suit, straining and sweating. The man in the hoodie, perfectly still, holding the line. Let go. Brad shrieked, his voice cracking. Assault. He grabbed me. Sarah. Captain. He assaulted me. Brad ripped his arm free, only because David let him go, and stumbled back into the aisle, crashing into the beverage cart Sarah had just brought out. I want him off, Brad screamed, pointing a trembling finger at David. He's violent. He's a threat to flight safety. I am a Diamond Platinum member, and I am demanding you remove this man immediately. Sarah stood between them, her hands raised. Sir, please lower your voice. Don't tell me what to do. Brad turned on her. Call the police. Now. Or I sue this entire airline into the ground. David didn't shout back. He didn't plead his case. He simply sat back down, opened his journal, removed the $500 bill, and placed it on the center console between them. You drop this, David said. Then he waited. He knew the police were coming. He counted on it. In fact, he was banking on it. Elias in 1C leaned forward. Son, he said to Brad, you are digging a hole. Put the shovel down. Shut up, old man. Brad yelled. This doesn't concern you. Elias sat back, a grim smile playing on his lips. Oh, I think it concerns all of us now. Far back in the plane, the teenager in 2A checked his phone screen. The live stream counter was ticking up. 500 viewers. 1,000 viewers. Title it Rich Guy Meltdown. The kid muttered to himself. This is going to be gold. Outside, the rain continued to hammer the fuselage. A drumroll for the storm that was just beginning inside the cabin. David took a sip of his water. He looked at the empty seat next to him, waiting for the authorities to arrive. He wasn't worried about being removed. He was worried about how hard he was going to have to hit back to make sure the lesson stuck. The sound of heavy boots clanking up the jet bridge stairs echoed through the open door. The Port Authority had arrived. The arrival of the Port Authority officers brought a blast of cold, damp air into the cabin, a physical manifestation of the storm that had been brewing inside Seat 1B. There were two of them. Officer Miller, a burly man with a buzz cut and a face that suggested he had seen too many unruly passengers and not enough coffee, took the lead. Behind him was Officer Ramirez, younger, sharper, her hand resting instinctively near her belt. They stepped into the first-class galley, their presence immediately sucking the remaining oxygen out of the room. The silence in the cabin was no longer awkward. It was judicial. It was the silence of a courtroom before the gavel falls. Brad stood up immediately. He didn't just stand, he postured. He adjusted his tie, buttoned his suit jacket, and smoothed down his lapels. In the split second it took for the officers to scan the scene, Brad had already cast himself in the role of the beleaguered executive. Thank God you are here, Brad said, his voice dropping to a register of reasonable, masculine concern. He pointed a manicured finger at David. I want this man removed immediately. He assaulted me. He has been aggressive since boarding. I don't feel safe and quite frankly, neither does the crew. He threw a glance at Sarah, a silent command for her to corroborate his story. Sarah stood by the galley wall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked at Brad, then at David, then at her shoes. She felt sick. She knew the truth, but she also knew the name on Brad's boarding pass. Diamond Platinum. The company handbook was clear. In disputes, prioritize the high-value customer. Her rent was due in 3 days. The fear of being fired was a cold knot in her chest. Officer Miller looked at Brad, taking in the bespoke suit and the gold watch. Then he looked at David. He saw the gray hoodie. He saw the worn sneakers. He saw a man sitting quietly with a bottle of water and a beat-up journal. The bias was instant and invisible. It wasn't that Miller was a bad cop, it was that his brain was wired to recognize patterns, and in the pattern of airport disputes the guy in the hoodie was usually the problem. Miller approached row 1. He didn't unholster his weapon, but his stance was ready. "Sir," Miller said to David, "we have a report of a disturbance. I am going to need you to grab your bags and step off the aircraft so we can sort this out." It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised as a procedure. David didn't move. He didn't reach for his bag. He didn't look intimidated. He slowly unscrewed the cap of his water bottle, took a measured sip, and placed it back on the coaster. "I haven't caused a disturbance, officer," David said. His voice was calm, contrasting sharply with Brad's frantic energy. "And I haven't assaulted anyone." He grabbed my wrist. Brad interjected, stepping forward. "He physically restrained me. That is assault. Ask him if he touched me." "Go ahead, ask him." Miller looked at David. "Did you make physical contact with this passenger?" "I prevented him from shoving an object into my chest," David clarified. "That is self-defense, not assault." "So you admit you touched him," Miller said, his patience already thinning. "Look, sir, I don't want to drag this out. The captain wants to push back. The easiest way to resolve this is for you to come with us. We take a statement, and we rebook you on the next flight." "Rebook me?" David asked. "On what grounds?" Brad laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. "On the grounds that I want you gone. I am a Diamond member. I spend $50,000 a year with this airline. If I say you are a threat, you are a threat." David ignored Brad completely. He kept his eyes on Officer Miller. "Officer, under FAA Regulation 121.580, no person may assault, threaten, intimidate, or interfere with a crew member in the performance of the crew member's duties aboard an aircraft being operated under this part." Miller blinked. He hadn't expected the guy in the hoodie to quote federal aviation regulations. "I am aware of the regs," Miller said, his tone hardening. "Good," David continued. "Then you should be aware that this gentleman has threatened the lead flight attendant's employment 3 times in the last 20 minutes, because she refused to move a ticketed passenger against his will. That constitutes intimidation. If anyone should be removed from this flight, it is Mr. Holloway." Brad's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You are lying. I never threatened her." "Sarah, tell them." All eyes turned to Sarah. This was her moment. The cabin held its breath. Sarah looked up. She saw David's eyes. They weren't pleading. They were steady. They offered her a strange kind of strength. Then she looked at Brad. She saw the arrogance. She saw the way he looked at her like she was a piece of furniture that had malfunctioned. Sarah started, her voice shaking. She cleared her throat. "He did say he would email the vice president. He said he would have my badge number." "There," Brad shouted, throwing his hands up. "That is not a threat. That is a customer service complaint. I have every right to complain about incompetence." Officer Miller sighed. He rubbed his temples. He hated these calls. 2 rich guys, or at least 1 rich guy and 1 guy who knew the law, fighting over legroom. "Look," Miller said to David. "It is the pilot's discretion. The captain doesn't want drama. The gentleman in 1B is a priority customer. The airline wants him happy. You are making this difficult. Now I am asking you one last time. Stand up." In seat 1C, Elias shifted. He had seen enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt. The click was loud in the silence. "Officer," Elias said. His voice was gravelly, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years commanding union halls. Miller turned. "Sir, please remain seated." "I am seated," Elias said, leaning forward. "But I am also a witness. And I am a retired federal magistrate judge for the Southern District of New York." The title hung in the air. Miller straightened up instinctively. Brad scoffed. "Great. The gallery is chiming in." Elias ignored Brad. He looked at Miller over his spectacles. "The young man in the hoodie is correct. Mr. Holloway initiated the physical contact. He attempted to force money onto the other passenger's person. When that was refused, he became belligerent. I have taken notes. Timestamped notes." Elias held up a small battered notebook. "If you arrest the man in 1A," Elias continued, I will personally represent him in the civil suit against the Port Authority and this airline. And I have never lost a civil rights case in my life. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted tectonically. Brad looked at Elias, then at David. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was losing control of the narrative. The poor guy in the hoodie wasn't poor. The old man wasn't just an old man. Brad did the only thing he knew how to do when the market turned against him. He doubled down. He decided to go nuclear. He pulled out his phone. Fine, Brad spat. You want to play legal games? Let's see how you like this. He dialed a number. He put it on speakerphone. The ringtone echoed through the silent cabin. 1 ring. 2 rings. This is incredible, Brad muttered to the room. I am going to have you all fired. Every single one of you. A voice answered the phone. A smooth corporate voice. Hello? This is Peter Vance. Brad smiled. It was a shark's smile. Peter Vance was the regional director of operations for the airline. They played golf together at the Westchester Country Club. Peter. It is Brad Halloway. I am on flight 402 to Chicago. I have a situation. Brad? The voice on the speaker sounded confused. I am in a meeting. Is everything okay? No, Peter, it is not okay. Brad shouted at the phone, making sure everyone could hear. I am sitting in first class, and the crew has allowed a dangerous, aggressive individual to harass me. The police are here, but they are dragging their feet because some senile judge is interfering. I need you to authorize the removal of passenger. Brad leaned over to peer at David's boarding pass on the console. Passenger D. Sterling in seat 1A. I need him gone, Peter. Or I am pulling my corporate account. That is $2 million a year in travel spend. Gone. Today. There was a pause on the line. The threat was real. $2 million was a lot of revenue to lose over one seat. Officer Miller looked at the phone. He looked at Sarah. He was waiting for the order. If the regional director gave the order, his hands were tied. It became a trespassing issue. The airline had the right to refuse service. On the other end of the line, Peter Vance hesitated. Brad? You said the passenger's name is Sterling? Yes. Sterling. He looks like a homeless person. Get him off my flight. Wait, Peter said. His voice changed. It went from annoyed to cautious. D. Sterling? African American? Mid-50s? Yes. Brad yelled. What does that have to do with anything? Just kick him off. There was a long silence on the speakerphone. Then a strange sound. It sounded like Peter Vance was closing a door. Brad, Peter said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Listen to me very carefully. Do not say another word to that man. What? Brad blinked. I said shut up, Brad. Put the phone down. I am calling the captain directly. Peter hung up. The line went dead. Brad stared at his phone. He looked around the cabin. He had expected an execution order. Instead, he got a warning. But his ego was too bruised to process the warning. He interpreted it as incompetence. Unbelievable, Brad muttered. He is useless. Everyone is useless. He turned to Officer Miller. You heard him. He is calling the captain. That means the captain is coming out here to throw this guy off. Do your job before he gets here. Cuff him. Miller looked at Officer Ramirez. Ramirez shook her head slightly. The situation was too messy. The judge in 1C was writing furiously in his notebook. The kid in 2A was still filming. Sir, Ramirez spoke up for the first time. We are going to wait for the captain. If the airline wants him removed, the captain has to sign the complaint form. We are not dragging anyone off without a signed complaint. Brad threw his hands up and collapsed back into seat 1B. Fine. We wait. The waiting was worse than the shouting. The plane was still at the gate. The air conditioning had finally kicked in, but the atmosphere was suffocating. David sat perfectly still. He hadn't looked at Brad during the phone call. He hadn't looked at the police. He was looking out the window watching the rain streak against the glass. Inside his head, David wasn't in a first-class seat. He was back in a hospital room 6 months ago. He was holding Elena's hand. Her skin had been like paper. Don't let them ruin it, David, she had whispered. It used to be magic. Flying used to be magic. Now it is just a bus ride in the sky. Promise me you will fix it. I promise, he had said. He hadn't told her he was buying the airline. He hadn't told anyone. He wanted to fix it from the bottom up, not the top down. He wanted to see the cracks in the foundation. And today, staring at the rain, he saw the crack. It wasn't the broken tray tables or the delayed flights. It was the fear. The fear in Sarah's eyes. The fear in the cleaner's eyes in the lounge. The culture of the company was fear. Fear of the rich. Fear of the loud. Fear of the Brads of the world. He felt a cold, hard resolve settle in his stomach. He wasn't just going to fix this situation. He was going to burn the fear out of the building. David turned his head. He looked at Brad. Brad was aggressively typing on his phone, probably texting his lawyer or his broker. He felt David's gaze and looked up. "What are you looking at?" Brad sneered. "Enjoy the view while you can. Captain's coming. You're done." "I was just thinking," David said softly. "Yeah, thinking about how you're going to get home? Bus ticket is cheaper anyway." "No," David said. "I was thinking about leverage." Brad rolled his eyes. "God, you love that word. You don't even know what it means." In finance, David continued, ignoring the insult, leverage is the use of borrowed capital to increase the potential return of an investment. But in life, leverage is simply knowing something the other man doesn't. "And what do you know?" Brad asked, mocking him. "What could you possibly know that I don't? I have the platinum status. I have the regional director on speed dial. I have the police standing right there. You have a hoodie and a bad attitude. I have all the leverage." David smiled. It was a sad smile. "You have borrowed capital, Mr. Holloway. All of it. Your status, your connections, your confidence. It is all borrowed. And the lender is about to call in the loan." Brad opened his mouth to retort, to deliver another crushing insult, but the sound of the flight deck door unlocking cut him off. The heavy, reinforced door clicked and swung open. Captain Miller stepped out. He was a tall man, gray-haired, wearing the 4 stripes of a commander on his shoulders. He looked tired. He looked like a man who just wanted to fly a plane, not referee a boxing match. He held a clipboard in his hand. He didn't look at the police. He didn't look at Sarah. He walked straight into the first-class cabin. Brad jumped up. "Captain. Finally. This is the man." Brad pointed at David. "I want him gone. Your regional director, Peter Vance, just called you, right? He told you to handle this?" The captain stopped. He looked at Brad. He looked at the finger pointing at David. Then slowly Captain Miller turned his head. He looked at the man in seat 1A. The captain's eyes widened. It was a subtle reaction, a microscopic widening of the pupils, but to anyone watching closely it was an earthquake. The color drained from the captain's face. He swallowed hard. The captain didn't speak to Brad. He stepped past Brad as if he didn't exist. He walked right up to seat 1A. The police tensed up, expecting the captain to order the removal. Officer Miller stepped forward with his handcuffs ready. "Okay, let's go, buddy," Officer Miller said, reaching for David's arm. "Stand down." The captain barked. The command was so sudden and so authoritative that Officer Miller actually jumped back. Captain Miller ignored the police. He stood in front of David. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. He adjusted his hat. He straightened his tie. "Mr. Sterling?" the captain said. His voice was cracked. David looked up. "Hello, Captain. I trust the weather radar issue is resolved?" Yes. Yes, sir. It is clearing up." Captain Miller stammered. We didn't know you were aboard. The manifest. It just said D. Sterling. You thought I was a deadhead pilot? Or perhaps a mechanic?" David asked gently. "No, sir. Yes, sir. We assume." Usually, the captain took a deep breath. He looked around the cabin. He saw the police. He saw the terrified flight attendant. He saw the arrogant passenger in 1B. And he realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had walked into a massacre. "Sir," the captain said, his voice trembling slightly. "Is there a problem?" Brad let out a laugh. He couldn't help it. The scene was absurd. Why was the captain apologizing to the homeless guy? "Is there a problem?" Brad mocked. "Yeah, Captain, there is a problem. The problem is you are talking to the wrong guy. I am the victim here. I am the one who called corporate. Why are you bowing to him?" Captain Miller turned slowly to face Brad. The look on the captain's face wasn't customer service anymore. It was the look of a man who was looking at a dead man walking. "Mr. Holloway," the captain said quietly. "I suggest you sit down and be quiet." "Excuse me?" Brad sputtered. "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," the captain said. "And I know who he is." Brad looked at David. David was still sitting there, calm, unmoving, the master of the silence. "Who is he?" Brad demanded, his voice rising in hysteria. "Who is he? The janitor? The union rep?" David closed his journal. He stood up. He didn't stand up aggressively. He unfolded himself from the seat with a grace that silenced the room. He smoothed the front of his hoodie. "Tell him, Captain," David said softly. Captain Miller took a breath. He looked at the police officers, then at Sarah, and finally at Brad. "This is David Sterling," the captain announced, his voice ringing through the cabin. "He is the chairman of Sterling Aviation Partners." The silence that followed was absolute. Brad started, but the words died in his throat. "He bought the airline on Tuesday," the captain continued. "Mr. Holloway, you are currently shouting at the owner of this aircraft." Brad looked at David. The hoodie, the jeans, the sneakers, the borrowed capital, the leverage. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled. He grabbed the back of seat 1B to steady himself. The phone in Brad's pocket buzzed. It was a text message. But Brad didn't check it. He couldn't move. He was staring into the eyes of the man he had just tried to bribe with $500. David took a step forward. He picked up the $500 bill from the console where he had left it. He held it out to Brad. "I believe this belongs to you," David said. "You might need it. Taxis from JFK can be expensive this time of day." The $500 bill felt heavy in Brad's hand, heavier than a brick, heavier than the gold Rolex ticking uselessly on his wrist. The cabin of the Boeing 777 was so quiet that the sound of the rain stopping outside seemed deafening. The storm had passed, but inside the fuselage, the air pressure had dropped to zero. Brad looked at the bill. He looked at the captain. He looked at David. For a moment, his brain simply refused to process the data. It was a cognitive dissonance so severe it felt like vertigo. The man in the hoodie could not be the owner. It was impossible. Owners wore suits. Owners shouted. Owners looked like him. This man, this quiet figure who picked up trash and read old journals, was an anomaly that Brad's worldview could not accommodate. "You are joking," Brad whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. "This is a prank. Is this one of those hidden camera shows? Where are the cameras?" He spun around, looking for a lens, looking for a producer to step out and tell him he had been punked. Instead, he saw the teenager in seat 2A holding up a smartphone, the red recording light steady and unblinking. He saw Elias in 1C, the retired judge, closing his notebook with a snap that sounded like a gunshot. He saw Sarah, the flight attendant he had threatened to fire, staring at David with a mixture of terror and awe. "It is not a prank, Mr. Holloway," Captain Miller said. His voice was cold, stripped of all customer service warmth. "And I am waiting for your answer. Are you going to leave this aircraft voluntarily? Or do I need to authorize the officers to assist you?" Brad's survival instinct, dormant for years under layers of privilege, finally kicked in. He realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He dropped the money. It fluttered to the floor, landing on the blue carpet next to his Italian leather loafers. He forced a smile. It was a gruesome expression, stretching his skin tight over his teeth. "Mr. Sterling," Brad said, turning to David. He opened his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Look, let's all take a breath here. We are businessmen. Rational men. I didn't know. Obviously I didn't know." He let out a short, nervous laugh. "If I had known it was you, obviously I wouldn't have offered you money for the seat. I would have offered to buy you a drink. It was a misunderstanding. A negotiation tactic. You know how it is. High stakes. The stress of the deal. I'm sure you've had days like this." Brad took a step toward David, invading his personal space again, trying to re-establish the camaraderie of the elite. "I'm actually closing the Triton merger today," Brad continued, his voice speeding up. "It's a $4 billion acquisition. That's why I'm so on edge. You get it, right? We're on the same team here. The 1%. Us against the world." David watched him. He didn't step back. He didn't blink. He watched Brad's performance with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "We are not on the same team," David said. The softness of his voice made the rejection hit harder. "You mistake net worth for value," David continued. "You think because we both have money we share a code. But my code does not include abusing employees who are paid to ensure your safety. My code does not include bribing strangers. And my code certainly does not include judging a man's worth by the fabric of his shirt." Brad's smile faltered. The S against the world tactic wasn't working. He pivoted to anger, the last refuge of the entitled. "Okay, fine," Brad snapped. "You want to lecture me? Fine. Lecture me. But I have a ticket. A valid paid first-class ticket. You can't just kick me off because I hurt your feelings. That's breach of contract. I have rights." David turned to Officer Miller. The police officer was standing very still, trying to make himself invisible. He was terrified. He had almost handcuffed the owner of the airline. He was mentally calculating his pension and wondering if it was about to evaporate. "Officer," David said. "Yes, sir?" Miller responded instantly, his posture snapping to attention. David pointed to the floor, to the discarded $500 bill. "Did you witness this passenger attempt to bribe a federal witness?" David asked. Officer Miller blinked. "A federal witness? I am now a witness to a crime," David clarified. "The crime of interference with a flight crew. And this money was an attempt to silence me. That is witness tampering. Or at the very least a disorderly conduct violation." Miller looked at the money. He looked at Brad. He saw a lifeline. If he arrested Brad, he was siding with the owner. He was saving his own skin. "Yes, sir," Miller said, his voice finding its strength. "I witnessed the transaction." And David continued, turning back to Brad regarding your rights. "You mentioned the contract. Let's discuss the contract of carriage. Section 9. David didn't need to look it up. He had spent the last 6 months memorizing every line of the airline's operating documents. The carrier may refuse to transport any passenger who appears to be intoxicated, under the influence of drugs, or, David paused for effect, whose conduct is disorderly, abusive, or violent, or whose behavior may be hazardous to himself, the crew, or other passengers. David stepped closer to Brad. "You threatened the lead flight attendant. You created a hostile environment. You attempted to bribe a passenger. And you wasted the time of the port authority and the flight deck. By my calculation, you have violated Section 9 about 4 different ways. So," David finished, his voice final, "you are trespassing on my aircraft. Get off." Brad stared at him. The reality was setting in. He wasn't just losing the seat. He was losing the war. "You can't do this," Brad hissed. "Do you know how much bad press I can generate? I know people at the Wall Street Journal. I know people at CNBC. I will tank your stock. I will make you look like a petty tyrant who abuses his power to kick off paying customers." David raised an eyebrow. He looked past Brad toward seat 2A. "Young man," David called out to the teenager. The kid popped his head up. "Yes, sir? Are you still recording?" "Yes, sir. Been live for 20 minutes. How many viewers?" The kid checked his screen. His eyes went wide. 14,000. And climbing. It just got retweeted by Barstool Sports." David looked back at Brad. "I don't think you need to call the Wall Street Journal," David said. "I think the press release has already gone out." Brad whipped around to look at the kid. The red light on the phone was a burning eye. 14,000 people. 14,000 people had seen him beg. Seen him bribe. Seen him get owned. Brad's face went pale. He patted his pockets looking for his own phone. He pulled it out. The screen was lit up with notifications. Text messages. Missed calls. Twitter alerts. One name dominated the screen. The boss. The phone rang in his hand. It vibrated violently like a bomb about to detonate. Brad stared at it. He didn't want to answer. He knew what was on the other end. But he couldn't stop himself. It was muscle memory. When the boss calls, you answer. He brought the phone to his ear. His hand was shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "Hello?" Brad whispered. The voice on the other end was loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. It was a scream. A primal scream of corporate rage. "You absolute moron." Brad flinched. "Sir, I can explain." "Explain?" Explain what? The voice roared. That I have the partners from Triton sitting in my conference room watching you on YouTube? Watching you throw money at a black man? Watching you scream at a stewardess? Sir, it's out of context. Brad pleaded. He's the owner. He tricked me. I don't care if he's the Pope. The voice screamed. The Triton deal is dead, Brad. They just walked out. They said they don't do business with bigots. Do you know how much money you just cost this firm? Sir, please. You're fired, Brad. Don't come back to the office. Don't even come back to the city. I'm sending security to clear out your desk right now. Your keycard is deactivated. The line went dead. Brad stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't judicial anymore. It was funereal. Brad Holloway, the master of the universe, the Diamond Platinum member, the dealmaker, had ceased to exist. In his place stood a middle-aged man in a suit that suddenly looked like a costume, holding a phone that was no longer a lifeline to power, but a paperweight. He lowered the phone slowly. He looked at David. There was no arrogance left in his eyes, only a raw, naked fear. Brad stammered. I just lost my job. David didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a witty comeback. He simply nodded. Actions have consequences, Mr. Holloway, David said. It is the one rule of economics that never changes. Officer Miller stepped forward. He didn't need to be told. He sensed the energy had left the room. The fight was over. Let's go, Sir, Miller said gently. He took Brad by the elbow. He didn't use cuffs. There was no need. Brad was broken. Brad allowed himself to be turned around. He walked down the aisle. He passed Sarah. He didn't look at her. He passed the kid in 2A. He didn't look at the phone. He passed Elias in 1C. Elias lowered his notebook. Good luck, son, the old judge said softly. Brad stepped off the plane into the jet bridge, into the cold gray reality of the rest of his life. Officer Ramirez followed him out, scooping up the $500 bill from the floor as evidence. Captain Miller stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them go. Then he turned back to David. Mr. Sterling, the captain said. I apologize. If I had known. Captain, David cut him off gently. If you had known it was me, you would have acted differently. And that is the problem. Miller flinched. He knew David was right. We will discuss the culture of this airline later, David said. Right now I believe you have a flight to fly. And I believe I have a seat to sit in. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. The captain retreated to the cockpit, closing the reinforced door. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged on. The cabin crew sprang into action, their movements sharp and nervous. They were terrified. The owner was in 1A, and they had just witnessed a massacre. Sarah stood frozen in the galley. She was shaking. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard. She looked at David. He was back in his seat, buckling his belt, reaching for his journal. She knew she had to say something. She had to apologize. She had to beg for her job. She took a deep breath and walked over to row 1. Mr. Sterling? She whispered. David looked up. He took off his reading glasses. Sarah, isn't it? David asked. Yes, sir. Sarah twisted her hands together. Sir, I am so sorry. I should have stopped him sooner. I should have been firmer. I failed to control the cabin. I know you're probably going to fire me, but please, I need this job. My mother is sick and... She stopped. She was rambling. David closed his journal. He gestured to the empty seat, seat 1B. Sit down for a moment, Sarah. I can't, sir. It's against regulations to sit with passengers. David smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had shown since boarding. I own the regulations, Sarah. Sit down. Sarah sat. She perched on the edge of the leather seat, looking like she was ready to bolt. David turned his body toward her. You didn't fail, Sarah. The system failed you. Sarah blinked, confused. Sir? I watched you, David said. I watched you try to de-escalate. I watched you try to enforce the rules. But you were fighting with one hand tied behind your back. You were afraid of him. Not because he was big, but because the company told you that his wallet was more important than your dignity. Sarah looked down at her hands. You're right. We get penalized if a platinum member complains. Even if they're wrong. That ends today, David said. He reached into his bag and pulled out a business card. It was heavy stock matte black with silver lettering. I am setting up a new committee next week, David said. The Cabin Standards Committee. I don't want executives on it. I don't want people who have never cleaned up vomit in turbulence or been screamed at for a delay they didn't cause. I want people who do the work. He handed her the card. I want you to lead it, Sarah. Sarah stared at the card. Let it? Me? You kept your cool, David said. You didn't shout back. You protected the other passengers. You have the temperament. Now I want to give you the authority. I want you to rewrite the training manual. I want you to teach the new hires that their safety and their dignity rank higher than any frequent flyer status. Can you do that? Sarah looked up at him. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relief. Of validation. Yes, sir, Sarah whispered. I can do that. Good, David said. Now go dry your eyes. We have a flight to Chicago. And I believe I requested a water refill about 20 minutes ago. Sarah laughed. A wet choke sound. She stood up, wiping her face. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. She walked back to the galley, but she walked differently. Her shoulders were back. Her head was high. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a leader. David watched her go. He felt a lightness in his chest. Across the aisle, Elias leaned over. That was a good thing you did, Elias said. David looked at the old man. I had a good example. My wife. She was a flight attendant. She taught you well, Elias said. David nodded. She did. The engines roared to life, a deep, powerful hum that vibrated through the floorboards. The plane began to push back from the gate. David put his headphones on. He didn't turn on any music. He just wanted the silence. He opened his journal to a fresh page. The page where the $500 bill had been was wrinkled, but the paper was still strong. He took his pen and wrote, Incident Report, Flight 402. Problem. We sold our soul for status. Solution, we bought it back. He looked out the window as the plane taxied toward the runway. The rain had stopped completely. The clouds were breaking, revealing patches of brilliant deep blue sky. The plane turned onto the active runway. The engine spooled up, pressing David into his seat. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 6 months, since the day Elena died, he didn't feel heavy. He felt the lift. He felt the momentum. The plane accelerated faster and faster, leaving the ground, leaving the airport, leaving Brad Halloway and his broken ego on the tarmac below. They were airborne. David opened his eyes and looked at the clouds rushing past. He touched the wedding band on his finger. We're fixing it, he whispered to the window. We're fixing it.